Good evening. This is the April edition of the Old Speedway City Neighborhood Association meeting. And tonight we are very happy to have Jason Vansickle here from the IMS Museum. He's going to do a little history of Speedway. And Jason is the Vice President of Curation and Education. So Jason, with that, come educate us.
Well, thank you, Barb. Thank you guys all for attending today, and thank you for watching on YouTube. Thanks for having me. So, like Barb mentioned, I am VP Education and Curation at the IMS Museum, and if you haven't had a chance to swing by, there's a lot of new activity at the museum, new exhibitions and things like that I'll mention a little bit later, but wanted to take some time and had the opportunity to talk about some of the early days of Speedway City. And also I am a board member here for OCENA, which is a great group. I've been now for about a year on the board, and excited to see what we're doing here. So the museum is pretty interesting. We have a few collection items that pertain to the early days of Speedway, but then I also branched out. There's a few other resources. If you have a chance to look online to check out, the Indiana Historical Society was a big asset in finding a few of these photos, images on their digital collection online. You could check that out. And then things like newspapers.com and a few other resources. But this is a pretty interesting vast real estate atlas that we have here in the collection. It's a pretty large book. Unfortunately, it's in very fragile shape, so we wanted to take some photos of it instead of bringing it in. We believe this was owned by Lim Trotter in 1909 during his, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but his time as a real estate agent, and really one of the driving forces behind the town that we know today. But if you notice this shows kind of the surrounding areas of what we now know as Speedway City here and outside of Indianapolis. Kind of in the middle here, you could see what would become the 480-acre plots of land that the Indianapolis Motor Speedway would be purchased by Lim Trotter for Carl Fisher and the other three founders. What's interesting about this book, and we can't confirm or deny, but there is a pencil drawing around the four plots that you can kind of see highlighted in that photo there with an N designated in the north. We don't know if that was Lim that put that in, but it's a great story to know that. This next photo is zoomed in a little bit more on what would become the town or Speedway City that we know today. This is just directly down, right underneath where it says Free Pike there. That is what we know as 16th Street today. It was Crawfordsville Pike. You could see the interurban line that at a diagonal intersects 16th Street. That was a very important item for the final selection of the Speedway being here 5 miles outside the city of Indianapolis. As in 1909, that was a vital thoroughfare for people to come to the racetrack. So there was an interurban station that was here before the Speedway, but the fact that interurban, what they called the Ben-Hur line that would go up to Crawfordsville, the fact that it was on the other side of the track property was a big plus during 1909. If you notice that kind of road to the left of this photo here, that goes down from 16th, but then is a diagonal. That is what we call Winton today. That was a street that was here before the development of Speedway. It was one of the permanent streets, and obviously 10th Street that is south of that. Also, you could see the what we now call the B&O Trail, but the rail line that ran down the southern portion of Speedway City. And then you see other items like the Dry Creek Run that cut through Indianapolis, or sorry, the Motor Speedway, and the Little Eagle Creek that goes to the golf course today, which we have. The other interesting parts, if you notice the little squares there, those are established buildings that were here in 1909. Which is another interesting component. But really, this was what would become Speedway City just a few years prior. and looking at some of the ownership and how much acreage that those ownership folks owned at that time, which would eventually be gobbled up by Globe Realty and Lim Trotter on behalf of the Speedway Realty Company. So we all know the story pretty well of the four founders of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway: Carl Fisher, James Allison, Frank Wheeler, Arthur Newby. In this photo here, you also have Henry Ford to the extreme left of the photo. He usually is cropped out because this is one of the only photos of all four of them together at one time. This was at an event at the Speedway. This idea of the four founders, though James Allison and Carl Fisher were implemental in the development of the track and Speedway City, there was also another member that really did a lot of the heavy work when it came to Speedway City, which was Lim Trotter.
Who is the tall guy there?
The tall guy was Henry Ford.
No, can you go left to right? We got Ford, and then who's the next one?
So you have, from left to right, you have Henry Ford, you have Arthur Newby with the glasses, the gentleman with the mustache in the middle is Frank Wheeler, Carl Fisher is the gentleman in the tan leg coat with the floppy hat, and James Allison is to the extreme right there. And like I said, there's various photos of them individually, but this is one of the only ones, pretty much the only photo. So you see this a lot, minus Henry Ford, who's cut out, which is probably one of the only Ford photos that they actively cut him out of. So, this photo right here, this is another iconic Indianapolis Motor Speedway image. It later on was entitled The Vision. This is, there's some speculation to where this photo was taken, but most likely it was taken somewhere in the parking lot between the outside of the grandstands of Turn 2 and where the Brickyard Crossing is today. It was somewhere in that vicinity. To promote the Speedway, when they purchased the land in early 1909 and made it public, this idea that Fisher had for many years of building a racetrack to test and prove the automobiles, especially the Americans compared to the European counterparts, and the fledgling Indiana auto industry, they had the opportunity to do a press release, a photo. And the gentleman that you see there is usually mistaken as Carl Fisher. It is not. It is a race car driver at the time named Louis Strang, which was one of the most prominent race car drivers and famous race car drivers at the time. Louis was on his way from track to track. This was taken in early 1909. And when he was on his way to the next race, they pretty much worked him into the schedule and took this iconic photo of the model that they made in the farm field, if you will. Another interesting point, Louis Strang would start on pole for the inaugural Indianapolis 500 in 1911, and that was not like today where they qualify with speed. It was based on the when they received the entry, so it was based on timing. Another interesting point, if you look in the background of that photo, there is a barn with a kind of center top middle, straight behind Louis there. We believe that is the barn that is currently just outside the Brickyard Crossing that you see if you're driving up Olin and at that three-way stop at 16th Street. You see a big white barn with the green top. That is that barn, and it is the oldest surviving building on the Speedway property.
Is there any reason to think that that barn's in its original location or not?
It's probably in its original location, but I know they've done restorations over the years.
His last name was Lang.
Strang, S-T-R-A-N-G, Strang. But unfortunately, the founders, which they would go on to, in their various ways, become very successful. Fisher and Allison, they've had their credit, if you will, with publications and various topics written about them. But there's one gentleman that was part of this entire process that, though he was a powerhouse in his day, a real estate broker, in history has kind of taken a step back from the four founders, and that gentleman is Lim Trotter. And Lim Trotter, he's a pretty interesting character. He was born in 1870 in Danville, Illinois, or Indiana. Unfortunately, when he was younger, his father left him, so he was supported by his mother. There's a bit of confusion in publications. He claims he had 4 years of schooling before he went off to go work and support his mother. Based on censuses that I've looked up recently, he's written 8 in some years, so which is it's not uncommon for the era. Obviously, formal education and grade school, a lot of people had that and then would go off to work farms or fields or things like that. He moved to Indianapolis in 1888, had a variety of different jobs. He worked as a stone cutter. There's an anecdote where he said he was paid $3 a week for his stone cutting business, but his apartment cost him $3.25 a week, so he was actually losing money during that time. He sold insurance, and he actually also operated a turkey farm that was outside of Canby, Indiana, which would continue to be something that he did. He started the Lim Trotter Real Estate and Insurance Company around 1900. And his office was in the State Life Building, which, if you're familiar with the Monument Circle diagram, it's on the south spoke on Meridian Street. The building is still there today with various offices in there. And he kept that office for the majority of his life, working. And this is a photo here of the office in late 1960s, and in the foreground is his desk. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a quality photo of him that I could use here. But this was one of the IMS photos that are in the archive. So it's interesting to look through this office, and then that plat map that was the first item that was actually hung up on the walls here in his office. You can see it in the background. So Lim was interested in the automobile, similar to Fisher and Allison. He caught that automotive bug, if you will, and was one of the early adapters to the automotive industry. He would connect with Fisher. They became very good friends, and really started this process along with Fisher of acquiring land on North Capitol Avenue in downtown Indianapolis and converting that into what we would consider now the automotive row. So he built a lot of showrooms with the land. He would sell the land to manufacturers for their showrooms. What we would now consider their dealerships would be the house their manufacturer and parts companies. All were housed on this North Capitol Avenue, which Lim had a part in. Two of the buildings that I know for a fact that still exist today, there's a location called the Gibson Fisher Building that is located on, I believe, Michigan and Capitol. It used to have, up until COVID, it had a restaurant called Sam's. But then south on Illinois, there was a building right on the the west, on the west side of the athletic club, called the Maxwell Briscoe Building, and those were two automotive manufacturers in the early days. And for the longest time, it held Acapulco Joe's, so that was another Indianapolis staple. So those two buildings are remnants of Trotter and Fisher's real estate work downtown Indianapolis. It's kind of interesting to look through the records and see these buildings that he would either propose or try to sell the land or things like that. Built multiple parking garages, obviously with that automotive component during that process. Later on in his life, during the 1920s, Lim Trotter actually served on the what we would now consider the Public Works Board during Mayor Duvall's time. From 1925 to 1927. Unfortunately, if you understand Indiana politics at the time, that was a kind of a dark time for politics in Indiana. And Trotter was on the Public Works Board, and he actually was kicked off by Duvall. They had a bit of a spat over how they wanted to pave roads, whether they were going to use asphalt, brick, or concrete. So that was a big kind of snafu that ended up leading Trotter and some other people on the Public Works Board to be kicked off by 1927. He actually ran for governor in 1940. And there's a big full page, if you go on newspapers.com, there's a big full page ad of Trotter kind of laying out his platform, if you will. for that, and I don't know how serious that mayoral run went. I don't think it really went. One publication said he only got one vote. So he wasn't a serious contender, but he did throw his hat in the ring to run for Indiana governor in 1940. He married he married his wife in 1927, Cleo Turner, who was another kind of stalwart of the early Speedway City community, and where during the 20s and 30s, he lived in the Columbia Club. He was part of the charter member of the Columbia Club downtown, had an apartment on North Meridian. But by the middle 1920s, 30s, he moved to Speedway. He lived in a residence off 15th Street where Cleo could take care of her mother. So all three of them lived in that house. And then later on lived on a smaller house on Allison. And unfortunately, he passed away after a 2-week bout with pneumonia in 1966. But he led a pretty full life at 96 years old, and obviously saw the whole city, and he was part of it. Develop around him, which he had a hand in. Trotter is also kind of the spearhead of selecting the land for Fisher for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The anecdote behind that, the story goes that Trotter and Fisher were out driving around, and Fisher was once again, because he was kind of ad nauseum for the last 7 years, talking about this idea of a racetrack and where he wanted to put it, and they looked at land in French Lick, and that land wasn't suitable because it was too hilly, and he wanted a pretty flat location that you could potentially see the whole track. The oxymoron of that is you can't see the whole track from one vantage point today, but at that time they wanted to see the whole track, and Lim Trotter said, hey, instead of talking about it, why don't we do something about it? I know of this land, which then a few days later he drove through here and saw the 4 80-acre plots that would eventually be the initial land for Speedway. So that's a little bit about Lim Trotter. Prestolite. And that is the other kind of coin to the early Speedway City development. Prestolite was a company that was formed by 3 members. Percy C. Avery owned the French patent to compress acetylene gas into cylinders. He connected with Fisher and Allison, and Allison and Fisher, and they saw this need to power headlights. That's what the acetylene gas tank would eventually do. And it really revolutionized driving at night, because before that you had carbide generators, which were very inadequate of driving at night, or you had lanterns. So really driving at night was when you take into account the terrible roads at the time that Fisher had a hand in fixing, it was a very treacherous thing to do. So this, for a lack of better example, the Prestolite container ended up becoming similar to like a propane gas grill. You had these acetylene containers that you'd put on the running boards of the car, and then there would be an igniter button that you would press on the dash, and then it would burn the gas in the headlights, causing the light. What really made this a viable option before the use of electric headlights was their distribution center. And if you would send in your empty canister by 4 p.m., you would receive a new canister the next day. So they really almost developed overnight shipping back in 1904, 1906, which revolutionized. So this is a Prestolite ad that is part of the museum's collection. Unfortunately, with Prestolite, there were explosions. So the tough thing was this was a very dangerous item of filling these canisters. You have this acetylene gas that you were trying to pump through into a copper container. The story goes they couldn't even insure the buildings that they were running the companies out of because the risk. There was 3 major explosions in downtown Indianapolis, and this was a nationwide company. It was headquartered in Indianapolis, but they had distribution centers and recharging and filling locations across the country and into Canada. In August 1907, the location here was on Pearl and East Street, just on the extreme east side of the original mile square of Indianapolis. And unfortunately, there was a fire that, luckily, there was no serious injuries. There were 25 employees at the time. The cause of the fire was a leaky tube that was leading from this large compressor that contained the acetylene gas, the tube that went from that into the smaller containers. But there was only 3 people that suffered minor injuries. A lot of those people, they suffered sprained ankles from jumping from the ladder from the second floor and things like that. So even though this looks very severe, which it was, luckily there was no injuries for this explosion. Only a few months later, the same location suffered another explosion in December of 1907. It's interesting, this one is more severe. Due to the August fire, all employees were kind of confined on the first floor because they found out the injuries were suffered from people trying to escape from the second and third floor. So they moved everyone to the first floor. But unfortunately, there was another incident, another explosion. This time, there was a gentleman named Elmer Jessup who was killed in this due to his injuries suffered. There was a bit of a backlash, obviously, for this process happening in the city. But Fisher and Allison, they were building a new location on East South Street, where the Ursay YMCA is today, if you're familiar with downtown now. They built this new reinforced concrete 3-story building. They claimed that it was this incident was not going to happen again, and unfortunately in June of 1908 it did. So this was the more prominent of the explosions. If you notice here, the Presto Light building is the large square building to the left. The middle narrow building in the middle there, that is a fire station. And then to the right that you can see the very corner of, that is the original St. Vincent Hospital. So unfortunately, this one, there was no fatalities, but there was 12 injured employees injured during this explosion. There was broken glass from blocks around the firefighters. They clogged the sewage system, trying to put out the fire, keeping the containers cool in there. There was a large beam that was shot out of the building, and it did damage to the hospital there. And there was also another steel beam that was shot from this location and landed in the Big 4 rail line. So this was really the straw that broke the camel's back for Presto Light recharging canisters in city limits. The local neighborhood associations, they eventually passed an ordinance about 6 months later prohibiting them from charging. They moved the charging system to a location on White River Boulevard or Parkway and River Street, which is near the GM stamping plant. But they were looking to rebuild and try to make this safer. But this was a pretty serious situation.
What street was that on?
That was Southeast Street.
Southeast?
East Street. So if you are going up Meridian from the south side, you take a right, you pass Delaware, and it would be right there, I believe, on your right. Today there's a YMCA they just built there. So this is a pretty good representation of what the public sentiment was towards Presto Light during this time. This newspaper cartoon. If you can't see on the arm, it has public sentiment pointing to the city officials that are cowering over to the side. Obviously, Presto Light's exploding, and then the ghoulie smoke that you see there inside that doesn't show up as well on the TV. It says minutes to human life. So obviously, they pushed the ordinance through. They couldn't do the recharging. They did rebuild. The reports, though they did damage across the city blocks, the building was pretty well sound. They claimed there was only $1,000 worth of damage that was done to the actual Presto Light building from that explosion. But they were, unfortunately, in 1911, they were building an addition to that Southeast Street location that was potentially to build starters, which in 1911, 1912 was a brand, car starters, self-starting starters was a brand new thing. Charles Ketterling developed that for GM in 1912. They were first offered on the 1912 Cadillac. So Prestolite was starting to get into that, and they built a 3-story building. Unfortunately, in their haste, they started to pour the concrete in November of 1911, and it never cured in time. This was the most fatal accident of the 4. Unfortunately, there were 10 workers that were killed in this incident. There was 25 that were trapped underneath the rubble and the concrete. Luckily, the other 15 were retrieved, though they had various injuries. There was finger pointing between politicians, Prestolite, the building ordinances at the time. But by this point, both Allison Fisher and Lim Trotter were looking for land outside the city to develop a self-contained organization. And we have the Prestolite building that we all know here that or still some of it stands on the east side of 16th and Main. This is the 1913 factory, the early photos. It opened during May 1913. Speedway, later in 1913, they started the Globe Realty Company that Fisher and Allison were the presidents on, but Lim Trotter really did all the work. One of the first things, obviously they wanted to lure factories, work, but also they wanted to build this community that would be on the west side of Main Street that we know today. It's interesting too because looking through the newspapers, they had a tennis club, and they had a Prestolite tennis tournament even back in 1913 that they had finals and things like that.
It's interesting to see the quality of the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing about this photo here, the water tower, which when you look at Indianapolis 500 history or stories, that water tower, though outside the Speedway, that was a very vital aspect to drivers in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s before they really started having the new the grandstands, the modern grandstands. But they would use that water tower to set up for turn 1 while they were turning into the corner. So that was a bit of an icon, not only for the Speedway City, but also for drivers entering turn 1 at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Why they were building this, a lot of you guys are familiar with this advertising for Speedway City. They were trying to attract more industry into the town, which is similar to other locations like Beech Grove, Indiana, and actually Mars Hill, which is a little bit closer. That was more built around the automotive industry too. Obviously, Speedway had a little bit better of a lasting legacy from an industry standpoint. But all these roads, all these lanes here, except for Winton, were laid out, plotted by Lim Trotter. He took night classes to learn how to go about that and laid them out. There's stories of him laying the 6-inch sewer pipe. And people laughing at him because saying that's way too big, why do you need that? And he had this vision of how the Speedway and how the city would grow. There's a few other locations that we'll show some photos here to finish off the presentation, but really showing some of these early buildings and infrastructures in the early days of the Speedway City. So this is a photo that's in the museum collection. This is looking south on Main Street from 16th Street. So you can see the front of Prestolite, that's the main building. Nothing on the right, where you would see our lovely restaurants and shops and storefronts. So this had to be taken early or mid-1913. Not yet a paved road, but one of the big hallmarks of Speedway City is that wide thoroughfare, because they wanted this horseless city, a city for the automobile, and they understood that there was going to be large streets that were needed for this automobile. Here's another photo that we have. This is the Rosner drugstore. that's still a staple of the community today. The interesting part of this was the south side, or the left side with the awning. That was the grocery store that was run by Frank Rosner, and his brother William had a drugstore that was on the right-hand side of it without the awning. This right here is a location photo looking down 16th Street, I believe looking west. But you can kind of notice some of those iconic Speedway homes starting to develop during this process. The other thing is the electric line also is running there too. Looking at some of the infrastructure that we have here, or businesses, this is the Swartz Electric Company, and this location, I believe it was off 16th Street, so the photographer's on 16th Street right here. It was to the east of Presto Light, so it's potentially somewhere near Poco Street today. This company, they made pretty much, for lack of a better term, electric generators in the time, and you could buy these generators to power country homes or mills or other small appliances. So that was their location. They had a small track that is located on the original Speedway City ad, if you look in that location. This is the Speedway Lumber Yard that had two locations. The early locations was, they actually leased the land from Presto Light. This was the far east, south of Presto Light. And this location actually moved around. In the 1920s, they couldn't renew their lease with Presto Light, so they actually moved closer to 10th Street. But this company lasted all the way till 1966 in the fact of the lumber yard here. This photo here, this is the beginnings of the Indianapolis Electric Steel Company, which then would change their name later to the Indianapolis Electric Steel Casting Company. This was a stalwart of Speedway. The small building is the offices, the large building is the warehouse. Looking at photos as late as the 1960s, those two buildings are there, but obviously more, as the company grew, more was added around it. It may be hard to see in the image here, but just north of that, there's a railroad crossing. That is what we now call the B&O Trail. And then the building that you see off into the distance, that's the back of Presto Light. So this is just south, I guess, probably where Speedway karting or somewhere around that location today on the east side of Main Street. This is the Allison Experimental building, built in 1915. I found these on IEPY's digital archive. Allison has a lot of their documents digitized and newsletters and things like that. This is the architecture drawing for the original building. Obviously, over the years, Plant 1 expanded on either side, the wings, but this is the original location that was the center. This also became initially for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Team Company. This is where they prepared the what they called the premieres that the team fielded through James Allison and Carl Fisher in 1915-16, and then would win the 500 in 1919 with Indianapolis driver Howdy Wilcox. This is Ursling Angus. This location was 1201 North Main. This building was, the company was founded in Lafayette in 1903. It was another electric company building headlights and things like that. They moved to Indianapolis in 1913, but then by 1923, they moved their location here to Speedway. There was a connection with James Allison, too, so that was one of the other reasons they moved here. This is the second school, or technically, if you want to call it the second school that was built. The first school, it was a typical Hoosier single-room red brick schoolhouse that was on the corner of 10th and Winton. It was on an acre, and that quickly, by the late teens, they needed more space, so they built this school here. It is on the location. It was a few blocks north on Winton, where the junior high is today. The schoolhouse. And then just a few other quick photos here. This location is looking east from Winton and 16th Street, so you can see the large sign that was on display to buy land here at Speedway. It was $10 down, I think $10 a month for your deed. The 614, 619 State Life building, that was Trotter's location at the downtown office, and you can start to see a few houses springing up in that location. And then second from last slide, just one of the iconic Speedway homes here, and I haven't had a chance to go perusing around the streets to figure out which house that is, but maybe that's someone that's watching or here, that's their house there. And then finally, just a last few items about the museum, like I mentioned earlier. If you haven't been to the museum, please check it out. You do get a discount as a Speedway, Old Speedway Neighborhood Association member. We have a few current exhibitions, second, that highlight the 43 drivers to finish runner-up in the 500 and never win. That closes in June, so it'll be open during the month of May. We just opened Epic Drama, the photography of Bill Pack. That is a publication that we put out that we just received the second printing of, so those are great birthday gifts and summer gifts for race fans. The Winners Gallery, over 34 winning 500 cars on display, traditions. And then later this year, we have 2 exhibitions that will open. Our collection, Your Favorites, which we just did a social media push, taking 25 cars, and the top 15 will be on display, so those results will be posted here soon. We have a few other events, Cars and Coffee this Saturday, an evening with Pato Award on April 19th at 6 p.m., and then Feel Up Friday, April 28th with Beth Beretta. So thank you guys, thanks for having me, and give it back to Barb. Yeah.
Do we have time for questions?
Yeah.
Go back 2 pictures,
Okay, let me see if,
which is the advertising sign
yeah,
for the lots.
I may need some help from the, yeah.
Now, the house that's in the background.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a story with that?
That house actually was in one of your previous pictures when you showed it looking down 16th Street.
Oh, yeah.
If you look
Looking
at it,
westward.
that's a two-story.
Isn't that Mary Agnes's house?
Well, I was thinking it might have been the one that got moved.
When did he
Well,
move?
Mary Agnes thought she had the oldest house in Speedway. Well, eons ago when she did actually work at the polls, but that's the corner of 16th and.
Winton.
Yeah, there's
No, not
right
Winton.
there.
Not Winton, Alice.
No, Winton. Well, the house, yeah, the house would be on Allison.
And I was thinking that was the house that got rotated around.
Isn't that a longer, kind of a longer house?
That other house that you were saying, I wonder who the owner was.
This one?
That looks like the shape, no, I don't think so. Because that actually was a bed and breakfast that they moved up to the corner of Winton.
Because I thought that the oldest house, or that's more of a longer,
Yeah, that's right.
that's more of a longer house, and now it has a kind of awning that I don't think was there, that was added on.
Because the front that faces the street was actually the other way. They completely did a 90-degree of it.
Oh, really?
In other words, the long ways was facing 16th Street, and they took it down and moved it because of the lot size. They had to turn it catty corner.
Do you know what year that was? You remember?
Yeah, I have it written down. It's not on here, but it's
Well,
written down.
that's the best thing to do because I know how the memory goes.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I want to
Yeah.
ask you a question
Yeah.
about the very first slide where you've got the map, the plat map.
Yeah, so this is something that is part of the collection, and it's interesting because there's no documentation on it. We believe it's Speedway, but the orientation of it's a little interesting because obviously the main, or the majority of streets here will run east to west. The building in the background there looks as if it's that second school, or that school that I showed the photo of, the back of that, and then I believe that's a post office that's in front of it, but which then if that's the case, Yeah, that's the hard part. It's trying to figure out what this really is. We know it was Trotters.
No, I want to go to more.
Oh, this one?
Yeah,
Oh.
that one. Now, this is 1909.
Yes.
They purchased the farm in what year?
For the Speedway?
Yeah.
In 1909.
Do we know what year they purchased the land for Presto Light?
So Trotter was kind of secretly on his own through Globe Realty gobbling up acreage between 1911 and 1912.
So when did Presto Light have the explosion at Methodist, across Methodist?
That was 1908.
1908.
So they rebuilt the factory. They moved the charging outside of city limits near the GM stamping plant, or what was there, and they were starting to look at this idea of moving outside the city and consolidating everything. But they did the renovations and the addition in 1911, but then they when that collapsed, based on the newspapers at least, that's when they started saying we're moving out and we're consolidating everything.
Because I'm trying to go ahead, Dave. Bring that back up. I'm trying to put together a theory that I've got, which may not be correct. Okay, the track's kind of drawn in there,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah.
So what I'm suspecting, as I found out the Presto Light business model was so important to the canisters being dropped off at any of the train stations that were linked in by 4 o'clock. So it could be a train station in Peoria.
Yeah.
Or a train station maybe in Cincinnati or, all over Pittsburgh. They'd get them over here. So having those 2 railroad tracks there, I'm thinking might have been and there was a train stop at 16.
Yeah.
I'm thinking may have been more of a driver for why this site was selected than just a flat field that had a creek running through it. It was an okay racetrack location, but I'm wondering if which was really the driver.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the Ben-Hur line was across the street was vital to the selection of the land in 1909 that became the Speedway. They would add other spurs off of that to accommodate Presto Light and some of the other businesses later on after the building was built in 13 and things like that. But yeah, that inner urban line, that was vital. And then if you notice right underneath Free Pike, where in parentheses there's a little square. That is what is believed, that one or the one that's right under 31 was that inner urban depot stop, if you will.
It was just interesting because the downtown inner urban station was a very important cog in the wheel. And when you read about the early races and how many people came here and the traffic congestion that existed, the train was an extremely important component of getting all the folks to the stands.
For sure. I mean, you had trains running almost continuously out of Union Station that were sending people to this location for race day. You had also, you got to keep in mind, 5.5 miles in 1909 was almost an eternity when you think about just outside the city. Now it's 15 minutes because you get some lights. But the fact that the rail line was vital. The other idea was that Fisher and Allison had this understanding of where the automobile was going to go and how 5 miles was going to be shortened in the perception. But then there was something like 10,000 hitching posts too for horses for use if you needed it for the first Indianapolis 500 in 1911. So they had almost everything except boat that Fisher was into. But you kind of had every form of transportation there. But you're right, the Ben-Hur line there was vital, the Big Four line.
A lot more people came on train than came in cars.
Yep.
Horses, and it just doesn't seem like there's much talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, it was a vital, I mean, there was, for the first 500 in 1911, there was no hotel rooms. People were just sleeping wherever they could, downtown in parks and benches, and they completely sold out of hotel rooms. So there's stories, there's other, later on, it's interesting to hear or read directions of how to get to the track from different locations. Traffic, Speedway PD and IMPD have it down to pretty much a science now, but they've been working on it for now 113 years, and even back then, getting people in and out of here was a science, and the interurbans played a lot.
You've seen the early programs.
Yeah.
They're fascinating to look at the way these guys pitch their concept.
Well, thank you, guys. I'll hang around if you have any more questions or anything, but thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jason. That was very interesting. If any of you have been intrigued by the early history of Speedway, if you go online and just Google Old Speedway City Neighborhood Association, there will come up. We've had some walking tours that we've done for Indiana landmarks, and that is on there. There's also a 45-minute narration that I did for the Women's Propylaeum Club last year for historic neighborhoods. So if you go to Women's Propylaeum Historic Districts, that'll come up, and that does a building-by-building history. So if you've been intrigued by this history, you can get more online. So we want to thank you, but what I would like to say before we lose most of our viewing audience, next month we're going to have a special meeting, and it'll be held on Main Street at the Performance Racing Industry Building. It's also, like Brian Herta's race shop is there, and it's been Harding, it's been Sarah Fisher's, but PRI is going to host us next month to have our meeting right there in their building. So come out in person.
Do you have the address for that?
No, not off the top of my head.
What's it called again?
PRI Industry, Performance Racing Industry.
It's 13th Street.
It's 13th Street. So anyway, we'll take a 15-minute break, and there's some refreshments in the back, and get to know your neighbor, and we'll come back and do our business portion of the meeting. Thank you.